A woman could stand beside the Tudor throne and still be disposable. She might guide alliances, soften negotiations, and steady a monarch's temper, yet remain unnamed in the official record. Protected, while useful. Condemned when convenient. Her influence moved in shadows, where law offered no shelter. Power welcomed her proximity but never granted her permanence. Tonight we step into those corridors to see how alliance, desire, and silence shaped her rise, and her quiet disappearance. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to observe the court of Tudor England, not as a spectator of romance, but as a student of power, the presence of a royal mistress would appear less like passion and more like policy. She did not enter the palace as an accident of affection. She entered as a possibility. At first glance, she seemed to exist within the private world of the king. Her chambers were smaller than the queen's. Her name was not spoken in official ceremonies. No crown rested upon her head. Yet men who governed counties and commanded armies began to notice where she stood during feasts and how often she was summoned after dusk. Nothing in Tudor politics was isolated from family interest. When a woman attracted royal attention, her relatives rarely treated it as mere sentiment. Fathers secured positions at court long before intimacy deepened. Brothers appeared more frequently in tournaments, councils, and hunting parties. Cousins drifted toward administrative roles. Advancement moved quietly, but deliberately, as though carried on a current that could not be openly acknowledged. An affair, in this setting, was rarely just an affair. It functioned as leverage. It created access. It altered calculations inside rooms where decisions were made. A nobleman seeking favor might approach not the king directly, but the woman who could soften him. A rival faction might measure its strength not by military numbers, but by how close its allies stood to her. The appearance of a mistress could disturb a balance that had seemed stable for years. A queen represented continuity. She embodied inheritance, diplomacy, and religious legitimacy. Her marriage was negotiated across borders or estates with careful deliberation. Her family was known. Her status was secure under the law. A mistress carried none of those protections. Yet she could influence outcomes in ways the queen sometimes could not. Her conversations were private, her counsel informal, her access is immediate. In a court built on ceremony and hierarchy, intimacy bypassed structure. That bypass created tension. Courtiers recalculated loyalties. Invitations shifted. Minor appointments began to cluster around certain surnames. Men who had once held unquestioned influence felt the ground shift beneath them. They could not accuse openly. They could not protest without exposing their insecurity. Instead, they watched. The woman herself may have believed she was simply favored. She may have imagined that charm or personality had lifted her. But behind her presence stood ambition broader than her own. Families understood opportunity. In Tudor England, lineage defined survival. Land meant security. Titles ensured legacy. A daughter's closeness to the king could translate into estates that would remain within the family for generations. Even a temporary favor might secure marriages for siblings or financial protection for aging parents. Emotion existed, but it was not central. Personal feeling was placed beneath strategic purpose. If affection aligned with advantage, it was welcomed. If it threatened long-term ambition, it was restrained or redirected. The court was not naive. It was understood that desire could be useful. It was also understood that usefulness could expire. The arrival of a mistress could unsettle established alliances. A noble house previously aligned with the queen's kin might find itself displaced. Promises made quietly over the years could dissolve within a season. Political equilibrium depended on perception, and perception shifted quickly when royal attention shifted. There was no official record of these adjustments. They appeared in subtleties, in seating arrangements, in hunting invitations, in which petition was answered first. The king's interest acted like a weight placed on one side of a scale. Even a small shift could tilt the entire mechanism of court life. Those who recognized this adapted quickly. Those who failed to recognize it found themselves diminished. Yet the woman at the center of this change stood without formal protection. She carried influence without legitimacy. Her elevation relied entirely on continued relevance. That fragility rarely discouraged ambition, because for many families, remaining ordinary posed a greater risk than gambling on visibility. A household of moderate standing could transform itself within a few years if proximity to the monarch endured. The reward justified the uncertainty. Still, uncertainty remained constant. Religion and moral rhetoric hovered over every interaction. Publicly, sermons emphasized chastity and order. Privately, ambition operated without such restraint. The contradiction did not disrupt the system. It sustained it. Moral language provided cover. Political calculation provided momentum. In this environment, a mistress was neither purely victim nor purely manipulator. She occupied a structural role. She was a conduit, a channel through which favor flowed and through which resentment gathered. Her existence proved that Tudor power was not only institutional, it was personal, and personal power required maintenance. Should affection fade, influence would contract. Should a scandal arise, families might withdraw. Protection existed only while the advantage remained clear. Once the advantage diminished, silence would replace celebration. The hall would continue to function. The council would continue to meet. The machinery of governance would adapt. But the balance would never be entirely the same. A Tudor mistress was not simply an expression of desire. She was positioned within a web of strategy that extended far beyond private chambers. Her presence could redirect opportunity, strengthen factions, and unsettle hierarchies without a single official declaration. And yet, her authority rested on the most unstable foundation available. She did not rise because of love, but because she served ambition. That ambition was tied to families who saw opportunity in proximity to the throne. And once that family interest is examined closely, it reveals how easily desire could become a weapon inside the Tudor marriage system. Marriage among the Tudor nobility was constructed long before a bride and groom ever stood beside one another. Agreements were drafted, estates calculated, and inheritances weighed against rival claims. A union did not begin with affection. It began with negotiation. Land determined survival. Titles determined influence. Heirs determined continuity. Families arranged marriages to consolidate property and stabilize alliances. A daughter carried dowry and connection into another household. A son secured territory and reinforced bloodlines. These arrangements were discussed in chambers lined with maps and account books, rather than in spaces devoted to sentiment. Love was not forbidden, but it was rarely decisive. The legal wife represented order. Her marriage bound two houses publicly and permanently. Through her, estates merged. Through her, future succession was secured. Through her, alliances between powerful families became visible to the entire realm. Removing such a wife was not a private matter. It threatened contracts, offended allies, and destabilized expectations carefully maintained over years. Marriage was therefore less about companionship than about structure. Structure carried weight. Within that framework, the appearance of a mistress did not destroy the system immediately. Instead, she introduced a parallel channel of influence, where marriage operated through documents and witnesses. Intimacy operated through access. Access could achieve what formal agreements could not. A nobleman might remain bound legally to his wife, while seeking counsel elsewhere. Private conversations could soften positions hardened during public debate. An estate dispute might be reconsidered after a quiet suggestion offered in confidence. An appointment might be granted more swiftly because affection reduced resistance. The mistress did not replace the wife. She circumvented the rigidity of the alliance. This circumvention mattered because noble marriages were often constrained by obligation. A husband could not easily alter property settlements once signed. He could not disregard treaties without provoking retaliation. Yet emotional proximity offered flexibility. Flexibility held value in a rigid system. The marriage alliance provided stability across generations. The mistress provided immediacy. One secured the future, the other influenced the present. Both existed within the same political environment, but only one carried official legitimacy. For many families, this dual structure was not contradictory. It was practical. A marriage arranged to consolidate estates might lack warmth. The husband's personal inclinations were secondary to family strategy. If he later formed an attachment elsewhere, the political framework of the marriage remained intact. Children born within the marriage preserved inheritance rights. Property agreements endured. Meanwhile, the mistress's presence created a secondary sphere where favours circulated more fluidly. Requests that might stall within formal channels could move through personal influence. A relative seeking a minor office might approach the woman rather than confront council resistance. Her intercession could alter tone. Even if it did not overturn established law, this did not mean she held institutional authority. She held proximity. Proximity altered rhythm. Courtiers adjusted their behavior accordingly. Those aligned with the wife's family maintained loyalty to established contracts. Those seeking quicker advancement gravitated toward emotional influence. Neither side openly declared competition. Yet tension accumulated. Marriage remained the foundation. Favor became the lever. In this way, the mistress functioned as a secondary conduit within a system already designed around alliance. Her role exposed the limits of arranged unions. Where marriage sought permanence, desire introduced motion. Where contracts sought clarity, intimacy introduced ambiguity. The woman herself stood between these forces. She did not possess the protection granted by formal marriage. She could not claim property through dowry agreements. She could not assert legitimacy before religious authority. Yet she might hold the ear of a powerful man at decisive moments. That ear could redirect opportunity. Families understood this distinction. Some guarded the sanctity of marriage fiercely, knowing that alliances depended upon it. Others recognized the advantage of informal channels and maneuvered accordingly. Neither approach rejected the political nature of marriage. Both operated within it. Because at its core, noble marriage was never purely personal. It was an instrument designed to reinforce land ownership, secure lineage, and stabilize influence. Within such an environment, emotion rarely dictated outcome. It was tolerated only when it did not disrupt larger interests. The mistress emerged not as a rebellion against that system, but as an adaptation to it. She represented a flexible extension of power within a structure otherwise bound by contract. She allowed influence to flow where documents could not easily move. Yet this flexibility came without security. Marriage endured through law. Intimacy endured only through attention. When attention faltered, the secondary channel closed. Thus, the existence of a mistress did not contradict the political marriage. It revealed its limitations. It showed that even the most carefully arranged alliance could not contain all forms of influence. It demonstrated that personal attachment could become a tool within a system already built on calculation. The Tudor court did not misunderstand this dynamic. It accepted it quietly, because power rarely travels through a single path. Noble marriage was engineered to protect land and lineage rather than nurture affection. Into that rigid alliance stepped the mistress, offering a more flexible route for influence. And once that alternative channel grows strong enough, it begins to disturb the very balance the marriage was meant to secure. A Tudor mistress rarely stood alone. Even when she appeared solitary beside the throne, behind her presence in the royal chambers stood a household that understood exactly what proximity to power could achieve. Her elevation was never interpreted as purely personal. It was assessed as an opportunity. Families did not measure affection. They measured advancement. They measured security. When a daughter attracted royal attention, her father recalculated his position within the court hierarchy. Invitations that once felt distant now appeared attainable. Offices that had been denied might suddenly reopen. The family name, once modestly placed among many others, gained a sharper outline. This shift did not happen publicly. It occurred in quiet adjustments. A brother received a minor administrative post. A cousin secured a place within the royal household. A land dispute that had lingered unresolved tilted gently in their favour. None of these changes required a proclamation. They required access. Access flowed through the woman. The relationship itself remained private in form, but its consequences were visible in the distribution of favour. Families understood this distribution intimately. They encouraged decorum, patience, and careful visibility. They discouraged recklessness. They knew that the advantage depended on duration. In Tudor England, land was protection. Without estates, a family's influence diminished rapidly. Without an office, income narrowed. Without royal acknowledgement, even noble birth could erode. A connection to the monarch functioned as a shield against stagnation. That shield, however, required maintenance. Relatives positioned themselves near centres of decision-making. They attended court more frequently. They aligned with factions that appeared sympathetic to the woman's presence. They avoided open arrogance. Aware that sudden ascent provoked resentment, resentment was constant in court life. Established houses observed newcomers. When a previously unremarkable surname began to appear repeatedly in appointments, suspicion replaced coincidence. Influence was rarely invisible for long. Rivals charted patterns through grants of land. Marriages arranged within a single season, and military commissions awarded unexpectedly. The woman at the centre of this expansion bore both privilege and burden. Her personal conduct became strategic. A misstep might not only damage her standing, but also jeopardize her relatives' advancement. She carried the weight of collective ambition in every public appearance. Her composure reassured allies. Her restraint calmed anxiety. Her proximity sustained expectation. The court recognized that affection could alter trajectories. A private audience could influence a tax decision. A softened mood might result in a pardon. A request introduced indirectly through intimacy could bypass formal resistance. These shifts, subtle yet powerful, translated into tangible benefits for those connected to her. Families acted quickly while favour endured. Estates were transferred without delay. Marriage negotiations for siblings accelerated. Titles were secured while the opportunity remained viable. No prudent household assumed permanence. They understood that emotional favour lacked contractual protection. Marriage alliances endured through law. Mistress-based advancement endured through attention. Attention was unstable. If the monarch's interest shifted, the family's elevation could stall. Offices might not be renewed. Invitations might thin. Allies might reconsider alignment. In such moments, proximity transformed from an asset to a liability. Families prepared contingencies. They maintained secondary alliances outside the immediate circle of favour. They avoided overextension when possible. They calculated how to retreat gracefully if necessary. Survival within Tudor politics demanded flexibility equal to ambition. The private relationship thus extended far beyond two individuals. It formed a network of expectation and calculation. The woman embodied access, but the structure behind her managed its exploitation. Her rise symbolized potential. Her decline threatened exposure. For many households of moderate standing, the gamble appeared justified. Remaining obscure offered little promise. aligning with power, even informally, created pathways otherwise inaccessible. The difference between stagnation and transformation could hinge on sustained proximity, yet the very visibility that brought advantage invited scrutiny. Rival families whispered of overreach. They questioned the merit of rapid promotion. They framed advancement as manipulation rather than competence. Moral language often masked political rivalry. The woman's influence became a convenient explanation for outcomes others resented. Her relatives felt this shift immediately. Appointments were examined more critically. Alliances required a stronger defense. Public appearances became more deliberate. Every gesture carried amplified meaning because it represented not only personal status, but collective ambition. The Tudor court operated without consistent mercy. A family that rose quickly might fall just as rapidly if attention withdrew. Without a legal claim to their newly strengthened position, they relied entirely on sustained favour. Once that favour cooled, the structure supporting them weakened. The woman at the centre of this system might perceive affection. Her family perceived the strategy. Both perspectives could coexist. The relationship provided emotional intimacy for one participant and political leverage for many others. This dual nature defined the role of a Tudor mistress within broader power structures. She functioned as a bridge between private chambers and public advancement. Yet bridges can be dismantled. If a scandal erupted or interest waned, her family's calculation reversed. Protection contracted. Distance reappeared. The same relatives who once advanced confidently might emphasize loyalty to the established order instead. Because in Tudor politics, survival outweighed sentiment. The presence of a mistress thus signaled not merely desire, but opportunity for an entire household. Her access created channels through which favour flowed, reshaping social and political landscapes quietly but decisively. And within that quiet reshaping lay inherent instability. She seemed to stand alone beside power. Yet behind her stood a family measuring every advantage. Their rise depended not on law, but on continued proximity. When that proximity begins to draw resentment, the cost of collective ambition becomes dangerously visible. The great hall did not fall silent when a king looked at a woman. Music continued. Plates shifted. Courtiers laughed with controlled restraint. Nothing appeared unusual to an outsider. Yet those trained in court life understood that a single glance could weigh more than a signed document. It was never merely attention. Attention at the court functioned as a signal. It indicated favour before favour was announced. It hinted at access before access was granted. A woman summoned twice within the same evening altered the geometry of the room more effectively than any public proclamation. Men observed the direction of the king's gaze with careful discipline. They did not stare openly. But they noted duration. They measured frequency. They tracked which faces softened under candlelight and which stiffened. A glance could imply elevation. Elevation suggested an opportunity. Opportunity extended beyond the woman herself. Her family, if present within the hall, would register the shift immediately. A father's posture straightened slightly. A brother maintained composure while recalculating expectations. Relatives positioned near the edges of influence felt a subtle warmth, as though proximity to the throne had extended outward by a few deliberate steps. Such moments rarely arrived by accident. Introductions had been arranged carefully. Appearances timed precisely. Gowns selected with restraint rather than extravagance. Every detail signalled respect without presumption. A calculated modesty often proved more effective than overt ambition. The court rewarded suggestion more than demand. Once attention settled, patterns began to change. Invitations arrived more frequently. A name appeared on guest lists for private hunts. Access to restricted corridors expanded quietly. None of these adjustments required formal explanation. They required recognition. Recognition carried weight within Tudor politics. It suggested that a woman might serve as an intermediary, that her words, spoken in quieter chambers, might influence decisions made the following morning. that her presence might soften resistance to a request otherwise dismissed. Families did not need confirmation. They needed consistency. If the glance repeated across evenings, confidence strengthened. A household once cautious grew bolder. A petition delayed for months might be presented again. A marriage proposal for a younger sibling might be accelerated. Plans previously considered unrealistic entered the discussion with renewed seriousness. The hall itself remained unchanged. Tapestries hung as before. Candles burned steadily. Wine flowed across polished tables. Yet beneath the surface, calculation intensified. Rival families observed the same glance. They interpreted it differently. Where one house saw advancement, another saw encroachment. Influence, once balanced delicately across alliances, tilted slightly. Even a small tilt demanded a response. Political equilibrium depended upon predictability. A new center of intimacy disrupted that predictability. Men whose authority had seemed secure found themselves questioning whether their advice would carry equal weight tomorrow. A woman's presence beside the throne did not rewrite law, but it complicated expectations. That complication bred unease. The woman herself might perceive only warmth. She might interpret the glance as affirmation, as admiration, as simple preference. Yet within Tudor court life, preference rarely remained private. It translated into consequence. Consequence moved swiftly. A recommendation made in confidence could alter an appointment. A softened mood might grant pardon. A quiet endorsement might secure land. Each outcome reinforced the significance of the original glance. It was not about romance. It was about momentum. Momentum, once generated, was difficult to contain. Families acted quickly to secure an advantage, while visibility remained favorable. Estates were negotiated. Positions solidified. Alliances strengthened preemptively against anticipated opposition. Yet every assent generated exposure. The more visible the connection, the sharper the scrutiny. Whispered doubts began circulating before any formal accusation. Observers questioned merit. They speculated about manipulation. Moral language often framed political rivalry, disguising resentment as virtue. The same glance that signaled opportunity also marked vulnerability. A household rising too quickly risked appearing opportunistic. A woman receiving repeated attention risked being described as an influence rather than a companion. In Tudor culture, influence attributed to a woman rarely remained neutral. Still, the hall continued its rituals. Music played. Servants moved quietly. Conversations resumed their measured cadence. No decree confirmed the shift. No announcement explained it. Yet everyone understood that something had begun. A glance could redirect fortune. It could elevate a surname within weeks. It could unsettle alliances maintained for years. It could also ignite a rivalry that waited patiently for a misstep. The Tudor court thrived on perception. Those who misread perception paid heavily. Those who read it accurately moved swiftly. The woman, at the center of that glance, stood at the intersection of ambition and exposure, carrying both advantage and risk in equal measure. Her rise depended on repetition. Her danger depended on visibility. Both were born at the same moment. A single glance in the Great Hall was never merely personal attention. It signaled advancement not just for a woman, but for the household waiting behind her. Yet, within that signal of promise lay the quiet beginning of scrutiny that would test how long such fortune could endure. Diplomacy in Tudor England did not reside solely within council chambers or sealed correspondence. It moved through corridors, across banquet tables, and sometimes into private rooms where conversation carried no witnesses. Within those quieter spaces, a mistress could become a conduit through which influence travelled with remarkable efficiency. Official negotiations followed protocol. Envoys were received with ceremony. Letters were drafted carefully. Each word weighed against potential consequences. Agreements were signed in ink. preserved in archives, and defended publicly. Yet not every decision began in those formal settings. Some began in confidence. A ruler's mood after an evening of private conversation could shape the tone of a council meeting the following morning. A suggestion offered casually might soften resistance to a proposal that had previously stalled. Emotional trust could accelerate what a written argument could not. The mistress occupied a position uniquely suited to this dynamic. She did not speak as an ambassador. She did not carry an official seal. Yet she might possess something equally powerful: uninterrupted access. In a court where rank controlled proximity, she existed outside certain ceremonial barriers. She could observe hesitation in a ruler's expression. She could sense frustration before it reached public display. Such observations translated into influence. A relative seeking favor might approach her discreetly, understanding that a direct appeal risked rejection. A foreign envoy, aware of her standing, might seek indirect introduction through shared acquaintances. Even without formal authority, she could frame information in ways that altered perception. Private conversation allowed nuance. Within a chamber lit by a single candle, a ruler might express doubts never voiced in council. He might question alliances, reconsider appointments, or reveal concerns about loyalty. These admissions rarely left an official record, yet they shaped policy profoundly. Information carried through intimacy could travel faster than parchment. Sensitive details discussed in confidence might influence how a request was presented later. A strategic concern mentioned in passing might prompt preemptive adjustment by those listening carefully. The boundary between personal trust and political calculation blurred. Trust, in this environment, held unusual strength. Signed agreements required enforcement. They depended on reputation, power balance, and external validation. Personal trust, however, required only belief. If a ruler trusted the woman beside him, her interpretation of events could carry disproportionate weight. That trust could redirect outcomes quietly. A proposed marriage alliance might gain favor after reassurance is delivered in private. A punishment considered too severe might be reconsidered following an emotional appeal. A diplomat's reliability might be judged not solely on documents, but on impressions conveyed informally. This did not mean the mistress replaced formal negotiation. Rather, she functioned as a supplementary channel, where official diplomacy established a structure. Informal influence adjusted tone. Tone often determined success. Families recognized the potential embedded within this role. They did not need her to command armies or draft treaties. They needed her to sustain trust. A word spoken at the right moment could achieve more than months of formal petitioning. Yet this position carried inherent danger, because influence exercised without a title invited suspicion. Rivals might interpret her involvement as manipulation rather than mediation. Failures in policy could be attributed to undue influence. If an alliance faltered, blame might settle upon the woman perceived as shaping decisions privately. The very access that empowered her exposed her. Still, the system tolerated this informal diplomacy because it functioned effectively. Tudor governance operated within rigid hierarchies, yet human emotion remained inseparable from decision-making. Personal comfort influenced judgment. Confidence encouraged boldness. Doubt delayed action. The mistress existed within that emotional sphere. Her presence allowed political matters to pass through personal filters. She might temper her anger. She might encourage resolve. She might present sensitive information in ways that felt less confrontational. In doing so, she shaped the trajectory without appearing in official documents. The court understood this influence, even if it did not acknowledge it openly. When a ruler emerged from private chambers and reversed a stance previously defended, observers noted the shift. They traced it not to new evidence, but to proximity. They adjusted strategies accordingly, sometimes seeking alignment with her, sometimes preparing resistance. Influence without office remained fragile. If trust weakened, access diminished. Once excluded from private conversation, her ability to mediate evaporated quickly. The diplomatic channel closed as quietly as it had opened. Yet while it endured, it operated with subtle efficiency. A mistress could never claim credit publicly. She could never sign her name beneath a treaty. Nevertheless, her presence might smooth negotiations that preserved peace or escalate tensions if misjudged. Her role was invisible in the record, yet visible in the outcome. Within Tudor politics, official structures defined authority. Informal channels defined movement. The mistress stood at the intersection of both, bridging private confidence and public consequence. She carried influence not because of rank, but because of trust. That trust could override hesitation and accelerate the decision. It could also distort judgment if placed unwisely. Diplomacy did not rely solely on ink and ceremony. It often travelled through private confidence. In that quiet space, a mistress could guide tone and influence direction without holding office. When personal trust begins to outweigh formal treaty, the consequences of misjudgment become far more difficult to contain. Royal favour in Tudor England rarely remained confined to private chambers. Once granted, it radiated outward, altering behaviour across the entire court. A king's preference did not exist in isolation. It carried administrative consequences. Courtiers observed patterns before they acknowledged them. When a woman received repeated invitations to dine near the throne, men adjusted their approach. When she was seen walking beside the king in the gardens more than once within a week, calculation intensified. Even subtle changes in seating arrangement suggested hierarchy shifting beneath the surface. Favour created gravity. Officials who once directed their petitions exclusively toward the council began seeking indirect access. A conversation framed gently in her presence might reach the monarch at a more receptive moment. A request dismissed formally might return through personal appeal. Ambition adapted quickly. A minister who sensed opportunity might align himself discreetly with her household. Gifts were delivered with careful moderation. Assistance was offered in minor matters to build goodwill. Access was cultivated patiently rather than demanded openly. The mistress did not need to declare authority. Authority accumulated around her. Over time, patterns became visible. Certain surnames appeared more frequently in new appointments. Promotions clustered among those known to stand near her circle. Minor offices, though seemingly insignificant, formed networks of loyalty. Networks transformed the atmosphere of the court. Those who benefited from favour strengthened their position through proximity. Those excluded recalibrated alliances defensively. Rival factions formed without public acknowledgement. Tension surfaced in small gestures, withheld information, delayed responses, measured politeness, masking suspicion. The political sphere grew sensitive to emotion, because if a king's mood could be influenced privately, then policy itself carried emotional undertones. A ruler irritated after a disagreement might respond harshly in council. A ruler reassured in confidence might grant leniency where severity had been expected. Governance appeared stable on parchment. In practice, it was vulnerable to temperament. This vulnerability unsettled experienced officials. Men who preferred predictability recognized the instability inherent in personal influence. The law provided structure. Favour provided fluctuation. Fluctuation introduced fragility. When a decision appeared to favour one faction repeatedly, murmurs circulated about undue influence. No accusation needed to be explicit. Suggestion sufficed. The court understood the implication instinctively. The woman at the centre of this gravitational field might perceive only intimacy. She might not recognise how her presence reorganised loyalties. Yet courtiers measured every visible interaction. A longer conversation at a banquet. A shared carriage ride after evening prayers. A private audience granted without explanation. Each detail signalled alignment. Officials learned to navigate this environment carefully. Some courted favor cautiously, hoping to benefit without overexposure. Others resisted openly, relying on institutional authority to counterbalance informal influence. The result was division, not open conflict, but layered tension. Alliances hardened, trust narrowed. Those aligned in favor advanced rapidly. Those outside it fortified existing positions. The court remained orderly in appearance. Ceremonies proceeded. Documents were signed. Councils convened. Yet beneath the ceremony, political equilibrium became increasingly dependent on one individual's emotional inclinations. If the king's affection intensified, her influence expanded. If irritation replaced warmth, doors closed abruptly. The speed of change disoriented those who relied on consistency. For experienced statesmen, this unpredictability posed a risk. They understood that a system governed partly by mood required constant vigilance. Stability demanded distance from volatility, yet proximity promised advantage. The tension between caution and ambition defined daily conduct. The mistress did not command troops or draft statutes. Still, her relationship with the king could redirect attention, soften policy, or heighten severity. In a centralized monarchy, even minor shifts in disposition carried national consequences. Foreign envoys noticed the pattern as well. They studied seating arrangements. They inquired discreetly about her influence. Diplomatic strategies adjusted to account for emotional factors otherwise absent from formal negotiation. Thus, royal favor extended beyond domestic factionalism. It influenced the external perception of stability. If governance appeared guided by affection rather than deliberation, confidence weakened. The court's balance depended not solely on institutions, but on the steadiness of a single relationship. This concentration of influence made the political environment delicate. One disagreement could realign alliances. One scandal could dismantle networks built over months. Favor elevated swiftly. Favor withdrew silently. Both movements reshaped the court. In Tudor England, authority flowed from the monarch. When that authority is intertwined with personal attachment, the distinction between governance and intimacy is blurred. Officials adjusted, factions consolidated, and policy absorbed emotional undertones. The result was not chaos, but instability. A court dependent on favor operated efficiently while affection endured. When affection faltered, uncertainty spread quickly. The fragility of that system remained invisible until tested. Royal favor did not remain personal. It reorganized ambition across the court. Around one woman's proximity, factions gathered and recalculated their futures. As governance grows dependent on the emotion of a single ruler, the entire political structure reveals how fragile it truly is. A Tudor mistress could stand near the center of power and still possess nothing that protected her. No document secured her position. No law acknowledged her authority. No formal title guaranteed continuity. Her presence was visible. Her influence was tangible. Her security was uncertain. The legal wife existed within a structure. Marriage contracts defined property rights, inheritance claims, and social standing. Religious authority reinforced her legitimacy. Removing her required justification that risked destabilizing alliances and offending powerful families. The mistress stood outside that framework. She might occupy chambers within the palace. She might receive gifts, yules, and estates granted in gratitude. Yet those grants depended entirely on continued favor. They were not shielded by institutional obligation. They rested upon personal preference. Personal preference shifted. A ruler's interest could intensify quickly. It could also cool without warning. The court understood this instability instinctively. Courtiers observed not only the rise of favor, but the subtle signs of its decline. Fewer invitations, shorter conversations, a seat placed slightly farther from the throne. These details required no explanation. They were read as clearly as decrees. Without legal recognition, the mistress possessed no formal claim to remain. She could not invoke dowry agreements. She could not rely on religious protection. Her standing existed entirely within the private sphere of affection. Affection, however, did not bind politically. If a king sought novelty, novelty could be found. If political calculation demanded distance, distance could be imposed. The woman who once received daily attention might find herself gradually excluded from the center of influence. Exclusion did not require announcement. It unfolded through omission. Her household might shrink. Gifts might cease. Those who once approached her with petitions might redirect their loyalty toward another rising figure. The shift occurred without public humiliation. Yet its consequences were unmistakable. Dependence defined her position. Her influence depended on access. Her access depended on favor. Her favor depended on sustained interest. This chain lacked stability. The court did not mistake elevation for permanence. Even at the height of intimacy, observers recognized the precarious foundation beneath it. Rivals waited patiently. They did not need to attack openly. Time often achieved what confrontation could not. The mistress might attempt restraint, discipline, and appropriate conduct to prolong her standing. She might avoid overt interference in political matters to prevent resentment. Yet her vulnerability remained constant. She could not secure succession for her children in the same manner as a lawful wife. She could not assert dynastic legitimacy. Even gifts, granted generously, could be contested or withdrawn if political winds shifted. Power flowed around her, not through her. This distinction shaped behavior. Courtiers aligned cautiously. They sought advantage without overcommitting loyalty. They understood that binding their fortunes too closely to a figure without institutional protection risked their own decline. The woman herself occupied a contradictory space. She might influence decisions privately. She might witness confidential deliberations. She might guide mood and temper in ways unseen by council members. Yet she remained exposed to sudden dismissal. Her proximity to authority amplified both opportunity and danger. In Tudor society, where hierarchy was rigid and law reinforced legitimacy, existing outside formal structure carried a significant risk. The Queen's dignity was guarded by tradition. The mistress's dignity depended on discretion and endurance. If a scandal emerged, protection evaporated swiftly. Moral rhetoric could be invoked selectively. Religious expectation emphasized female chastity and obedience. A ruler's conduct might be excused as human weakness. A woman's conduct could be framed as corruption or manipulation. Blame required a target. She stood available. Replacement remained effortless. A new face introduced at court could redirect attention quickly. Novelty appealed. Fresh alliances tempted calculation. The previous favorite might withdraw quietly, sometimes provided with distant estates, sometimes left without explanation. Her departure rarely halted governance. The ceremony continued. Appointments proceeded. The court adapted. This adaptability revealed the fragility of her position. She had functioned as a channel of influence, yet that channel could close without disrupting the broader system. The structure endured. She did not. Still, during her ascendancy, she existed at the heart of power. That centrality made the contrast sharper when decline began. Visibility magnified vulnerability. She occupied the throne's shadow, close enough to feel its warmth, too distant to claim its protection. In Tudor England, legitimacy defined endurance. The mistress existed in proximity to authority, but without its shield. Her rise depended on attention. Her fall required only its withdrawal. She could stand beside power and still possess no formal protection. Her influence lasted only as long as favor endured. Once that favor shifted, the woman who seemed central could vanish without disturbing the system that had briefly elevated her. Elevation at the Tudor court could occur with unsettling speed. A woman once seated among distant courtiers might, within months, you find herself positioned close enough to the throne to feel the shift in air when the king moved. The transformation appeared remarkable. It was also unstable. Favour did not announce its duration. It expanded quietly, through repeated invitations and sustained proximity. A jewel was placed at her throat, an estate granted under discreet language. A chamber was reassigned closer to the royal apartments. Each gesture suggested consolidation, yet none of them promised permanence. Royal affection operated without contract. It intensified through preference and receded through distraction. The court, trained to read change before it was declared, measured the rhythm of this attention carefully. Even while she stood at the center of admiration, observers assessed how long such centrality could endure. Those who rose high became visible. Visibility carried exposure. The more frequently she appeared beside the monarch, the more carefully she was studied. Her posture, her speech, her alliance. Each detail acquired political significance. Rivals required little justification to begin collecting evidence of impropriety. A perceived slight could be magnified. A minor error could be interpreted as ambition exceeding its boundary. Prominence invited scrutiny. Within the Tudor hierarchy, security depended on legitimacy. The Queen's position rested upon law and sacrament. The mistress's position rested upon preference. Preference could shift without consultation. No council vote was necessary. No legal argument required. One misjudged remark might echo through corridors. One ill-timed intervention might provoke resistance. One perceived manipulation might confirm suspicion. The court did not forgive vulnerability easily. Even allies maintained a distance sufficient to protect themselves. They aligned with advantage, but cautiously. If signs of decline appeared, loyalty thinned quickly. The same courtiers who once sought her attention might redirect their allegiance without explanation. The woman herself often recognized the fragility of her ascent. Composure became discipline. Speech was measured. Public appearances were calibrated to avoid excess. She understood that prominence required restraint. Yet restraint could not guarantee safety, because elevation sharpened rivalry. Families displaced by her influence watched attentively. They did not challenge openly unless certain of success. Instead, they waited. Time and rumor functioned as quiet instruments. Doubt accumulated slowly, often without a clear source. Reputation proved delicate. In a society that proclaimed moral rigor, the mistress existed within contradiction. She occupied proximity to the monarch while lacking the shield of recognized virtue. The language of discipline could be turned against her swiftly if political convenience required it. The greater her visibility, the easier it became to portray her as disruptive. Power lifted her above ordinary status. But it also isolated her. Few could approach without calculation. Genuine loyalty was difficult to distinguish from opportunism. The circle surrounding her fluctuated according to perceived strength. Should royal interest falter, isolation intensified. Favour might cool gradually, marked first by absence from smaller gatherings. Invitations could narrow in scope. Conversations shortened. Each reduction appeared subtle, yet collectively they signalled withdrawal. Withdrawal required no ceremony. The court adapted without pause. Another figure might assume prominence. Networks realigned. Attention relocated. The machinery of governance continued with minimal interruption. For the woman displaced, however, consequence extended beyond influence. Reputation, once amplified, rarely returned to obscurity without distortion. Whispers replaced admiration. Former proximity became evidence against her. A single step taken imprudently could cost more than a position. It could cost dignity. In Tudor culture, public honour defined survival. A damaged reputation constrained future alliances. Limited marriage prospects for relatives. and reshaped family standing. The ascent that once promised security could generate long-term instability if decline proved abrupt. Thus, elevation and danger advanced together. To rise through favor was to accept exposure. To benefit from attention was to endure scrutiny. The court's brilliance concealed its volatility. Power raised her visibly. Power surrounded her with opportunity. Power withheld protection. The structure that allowed her ascent did not guarantee her endurance. Royal preference offered momentum, but not a safeguard. Within that imbalance lay constant risk. Favor could lift a woman higher than law ever would. Yet it never granted safety. The brighter her prominence, the sharper the scrutiny surrounding her. A single misstep, almost invisible at first, could undo everything that elevation seemed to promise. The rivalry between a lawful wife and a royal mistress in Tudor England rarely erupted into open confrontation. It unfolded within structure, ritual, and silence. No accusations were shouted across banquet halls. No formal duel declared supremacy. Yet the tension persisted, steady and prolonged. The wife stood within the law. Her marriage had been witnessed, recorded, sanctified. She carried the authority of contract and the protection of religious approval. Through her flowed inheritance, under succession, and legitimacy. Her position reinforced alliances that extended beyond the palace walls. Order gathered around her. Her household functioned as visible proof of continuity. Her children represented dynastic stability. Her public composure reassured nobles and foreign observers alike that the monarchy rested upon a firm foundation. The mistress occupied a different sphere. She stood closer to intimacy than to institution. Her influence did not derive from contract, but from access. She did not embody permanence. She embodied immediacy. Where the wife symbolized structure, the mistress symbolized presence. Presence altered atmosphere. The lawful wife understood that her authority could not easily be revoked. Yet she also recognized that influence might drift elsewhere. She could not prevent attention from shifting, but she could reinforce her position through dignity and alliance. Confrontation risked diminishing her standing. A public dispute would invite speculation. Speculation invited weakness. Within the Tudor hierarchy, composure equaled strength. Silence preserved stature. The wife's restraint became a strategy. The mistress understood the limits of her role. She could not claim legal standing. She could not demand recognition beyond what favor allowed. Yet, she possessed something potent, proximity unmediated by ceremony. She might witness the monarch's doubts, temper his anger, soften his resolve. Influence did not require acknowledgement to be effective. Thus, rivalry emerged not through confrontation but through parallel presence. The wife hosted formal gatherings, reinforcing the alliance. The mistress engaged in quieter conversations, shaping the mood. One worked through an institution, the other worked through intimacy. Both understood the stakes. Courtiers navigated this tension carefully. Some aligned openly with the queen, emphasizing legitimacy and continuity. Others gravitated toward the mistress's circle, seeking immediate advancement. Few declared allegiance explicitly. Most balanced caution with ambition. The contest extended over years rather than weeks. It revealed itself in seating arrangements, in who accompanied the monarch during travel, and in whose relatives secured appointments. Each small adjustment signaled incremental gain or loss. The wife relied on endurance. Her strength lay in structure. Marriage contracts bound estates and alliances, too deeply to unravel without consequence. Religious sanction fortified her position further. Even if affection waned, legality remained. The mistress relied on influence. Her strength lay in emotional connection. She could shape tone, redirect conversation, and influence perception within private space. Yet without law behind her, every gain required maintenance. Neither woman operated in ignorance. Each recognized that open hostility would damage both. The wife risked appearing insecure. The mistress risked appearing manipulative. Therefore, the rivalry remained measured. Measured rivalry endured longer. It persisted through seasons and ceremonies, through births and political crises. The court adapted to its existence, accepting it as part of the delicate balance of power. Yet balance rarely remained neutral. If the monarch's preference intensified, the mistress's sphere expanded. If political necessity demanded stability, the wife's authority strengthened. The pendulum shifted subtly, rarely settling permanently. Whispers circulated without attribution. Supporters of the wife framed her as the embodiment of order. Supporters of the mistress framed her as a revitalizing influence. Language served factional interest while preserving surface decorum. The contest shaped governance indirectly. Policy decisions, appointments, and pardons carried undertones of allegiance. A recommendation supported by the wife's family might counterbalance a suggestion emerging from the mistress's circle. Compromise became common, not out of harmony, but out of tension. Both positions required discipline. The wife guarded reputation relentlessly. Any hint of instability threatened dynastic perception. The mistress guarded access with equal care. Any sign of overreach invited backlash. Time intensified pressure. A rivalry that began quietly could deepen into a structural division within the court. Children born to the wife solidified succession. Favor granted to the mistress's relatives redistributed influence. Neither sphere remained static. The struggle did not require raised voices. It required patience. Under candlelight, the court appeared unified. Ceremony masked complexity. Yet beneath polished ritual lay continuous recalculation between law and intimacy. The wife embodied permanence. The mistress embodied immediacy. Power oscillated between them. In Tudor England, authority did not reside solely in documents or solely in emotion. It moved between the two, sustained by tension that neither side could fully resolve. The lawful wife represented order, contract, and continuity, while the mistress embodied access and immediate influence. Their rivalry unfolded without spectacle, sustained by patience and calculation. Over time, this quiet contest shaped the court more profoundly than any public dispute ever could. Negotiation in the Tudor court did not always unfold across long tables covered with maps and sealed documents. It often moved quietly through proximity, through suggestion, through the weight of a presence that did not need to speak loudly to be effective. Within that environment, a mistress could function as a subtle instrument of pressure. She did not draft treaties. She did not preside over councils, yet her nearness altered calculation. Soft advantage carried its own force. A ruler, inclined to listen in private, might reconsider a position that had seemed fixed in public. A suggestion introduced gently, framed as concern rather than demand, could temper resistance more effectively than argument. Those who understood this dynamic learned to approach influence indirectly. Confrontation risked failure. Indirect appeal offered a possibility. When an office became vacant or a military commission awaited assignment, competition intensified. Candidates presented credentials formally, but many also sought alternative routes. If a mistress was known to enjoy trust, her ear became valuable. A word spoken at the right moment could redirect attention. It did not need to resemble a command. It could appear as curiosity. It could arrive as a question about a man's loyalty or competence. It could be framed as reassurance about another's reliability. Tone shaped perception. Perception shaped the decision. Courtiers recognized that personal closeness created an opportunity to influence mood. A ruler fatigued by debate might respond more readily to a perspective offered in private calm. Frustration expressed during the council might soften by evening. Within that softening lay potential leverage. This leverage did not require a threat. It relied on familiarity. families seeking advancement calculated accordingly. Rather than confront resistance openly, they might encourage a relative to secure private favor first. Once emotional trust existed, formal negotiation became easier. Objections encountered less force. Appointments proceeded with less scrutiny. Influence became currency. It could be accumulated quietly. It could be exchanged strategically. It did not appear on parchment, yet its effect rivaled official endorsement. The mistress stood at the center of this exchange. Her value in negotiation did not stem from command, but from atmosphere. She might shape how information is received. She might present a request as moderate rather than ambitious. She might contextualize opposition as unnecessary severity. These adjustments required discretion. Too visible an intervention invited suspicion. Too forceful a recommendation suggested manipulation. The most effective pressure remained almost invisible, woven into ordinary conversation. Rival factions understood this mechanism. If appointments repeatedly favored those connected to her circle, resentment hardened. Opponents framed outcomes as favoritism rather than merit. The line between persuasion and interference blurred easily. Yet the system tolerated such ambiguity because political negotiation was rarely neutral. Every decision carried implications for land, income, and prestige. Soft pressure provided a means to navigate resistance without public conflict. In this way, personal influence became capital. Capital could be invested in strategic moments. It could be withheld to preserve stability. It could also depreciate rapidly if trust weakened. The mistress herself bore risk in this role. If a recommended candidate failed, blame could return to her. If a decision sparked controversy, her involvement might be scrutinized. Influence amplified both success and consequence. Still, for many families, the potential reward justified exposure. A younger son might secure a governorship. A contested estate might be resolved favorably. A diplomatic hesitation might ease. Each instance reinforced the perception that proximity equaled advantage. The Tudor court operated within a formal hierarchy, yet it depended heavily on human relationships. Authority flowed from the monarch, but access determined how that authority was exercised. Negotiation thus required more than argument. It required placement. Placement defined leverage. A mistress did not replace institutional power. She redirected its emphasis. Her presence could transform negotiation from a rigid contest into an adjustable conversation. She functioned as a channel through which ambition moved more quietly. This quiet movement proved potent. Officials who ignored it risked stagnation. Those who overused it risked exposure. Balance determined survival. In a monarchy where the sovereign's will defines the outcome, influencing that will indirectly could prove decisive. The distinction between persuasion and pressure remained subtle, often unrecorded, yet its consequences were tangible. Appointments altered careers. Favors reshaped fortunes. Private words redirected public policy. The mistress existed within this delicate structure, embodying leverage without mandate. Her influence could not be codified, yet it operated persistently. Her closeness created a form of pressure that required no formal demand. A single suggestion could redirect appointments and alter trajectories. In a court where personal trust carried political weight, influence itself became a form of currency capable of reshaping negotiation. Desire in Tudor England was never discussed as a private matter alone. It was measured against doctrine, against expectation, against a moral framework that placed particular weight upon women. Within that framework, judgment rarely fell evenly. The language of virtue-filled sermons, obedience, chastity, restraint, these ideals defined the acceptable boundaries of female conduct. A lawful wife was praised for modesty and silence. Her dignity strengthened the image of household order. Her discipline reassured society that hierarchy remained intact. The mistress existed outside that reassurance. Her proximity to power, while tolerated in practice, conflicted with public rhetoric, though the court might accommodate her presence. Moral discourse framed such intimacy as a deviation. The tension between acceptance and condemnation remained constant. Men occupied a different position within this equation. A ruler's indulgence could be described as human weakness. It might be criticized privately, but it rarely destroyed authority. Masculine desire was treated as flawed but forgivable. Political necessity often overshadowed moral scrutiny. The woman bore a heavier consequence. If instability emerged at court, observers sought an explanation. Policy failures, financial strain, or diplomatic missteps could be attributed conveniently to undue influence. Blame travelled toward the most vulnerable figure. The mistress offered a visible target. Her intimacy with the monarch made her accessible to accusation. Her lack of legal status made defense difficult. The same closeness that granted influence rendered her suspect. Whispers rarely needed evidence. A failed appointment might be framed as favoritism. A controversial decision might be attributed to manipulation, even without proof. Repetition created perception. Perception shaped reputation. Reputation defined survival. Within Tudor society, moral expectations operated as social enforcement. Women were expected to embody purity and submission. Deviation invited scrutiny disproportionate to male counterparts. A ruler might retain sovereignty after a scandal. A woman might lose standing entirely. This imbalance reinforced hierarchy. The mistress's conduct was examined through a lens sharpened by gendered expectation. Her speech, her atta, and her associations acquired symbolic weight. If she appeared confident, she risked being labelled ambitious. If she appeared withdrawn, she risked appearing calculating. No posture guarantees safety. The court's tolerance of her presence did not equate to endorsement. It represented accommodation within political reality. Public morality and private practice coexisted uneasily. Religious authority amplified this tension. Clerics preached discipline, while nobles navigated complexity. The contradiction did not dismantle the system, it sustained it. Moral language could be invoked selectively when convenient, if removal became necessary. Righteousness, justified. A ruler's withdrawal of favour might be framed as moral correction rather than political adjustment. The narrative could shift quickly from admiration to condemnation. The mistress transformed from a trusted companion to a cautionary example. The transformation required little explanation. Society often accepted it without challenge, because the framework already positioned her as a deviation. Families connected to her understood this risk. They encouraged discretion, appropriate conduct, and visible modesty. They knew that a single scandal could activate moral outrage disproportionate to circumstance. Outrage provided cover for political repositioning. Rivals might cloak ambition in virtue. Accusation became an instrument. Public censure reinforced private strategy. Meanwhile, the monarch's authority remained largely intact. Even in moments of controversy, sovereignty endured. The woman's status did not. The asymmetry revealed how deeply moral expectation intersected with gender and power. Desire was never neutral. In men, it could be contextualized. In women, it could be weaponized. The mistress thus inhabited a space where influence coexisted with vulnerability. She could guide policy quietly, yet she stood perpetually at risk of being framed as a corrupting presence. The moral code did not operate abstractly. It functioned as a mechanism. Mechanism sustained order by concentrating blame. This concentration preserved hierarchy. By isolating perceived transgression within a female figure, the broader system avoided destabilization. Authority remained centralized. Responsibility shifted outward. The woman bore consequence for dynamics she did not design. Her existence exposed the contradiction between the proclaimed virtue and the practiced politics. Yet the contradiction rarely resulted in reform. It resulted in punishment. Visibility intensified risk. The more prominent her influence, the easier it became to portray her as a source of disorder. Her ascent might inspire admiration briefly. Her decline might inspire condemnation swiftly. Within Tudor culture, morality and politics intertwined closely. Judgment is rarely separated from calculation. The mistress functioned at the intersection of both, absorbing tension that preserved broader stability. Moral standards in Tudor England weighed heavily upon women. While men often escaped equivalent scrutiny, the mistress's intimacy with power made her a convenient symbol of excess or corruption. In a court eager to preserve order, she could be transformed from a favoured companion into an embodiment of moral failure with unsettling speed. The same act could unfold within the same chamber, under the same candlelight, and produce two entirely different outcomes. In Tudor England, conduct did not exist in isolation from hierarchy. It was interpreted according to position. A monarch's desire might be described as weakness, indulgence, or temperament. None of these descriptions required removal from power. Authority absorbed fault. Sovereignty endured. The woman involved did not possess such insulation. Her role lacked a legal foundation. Her presence depended on acceptance that could dissolve without explanation. The behavior that elevated her in one season could condemn her in the next. Power altered consequence. A man who strayed from marital expectation retained property, title, and command. His lapse might invite criticism, but it did not dismantle his legitimacy. Advisors remained in place. Councils continued to convene. A woman in similar proximity faced a different calculation. If the scandal intensified, she could be excluded from court. Invitations might cease. Conversations might fall silent when she entered. Withdrawal occurred gradually, then completely. Society framed this divergence as a natural order. Authority was associated with masculinity, while vulnerability was attached to femininity. The imbalance appeared so familiar that few questioned its fairness. It functioned as an assumption rather than a policy. Public narrative reinforced the pattern. When rumours circulated, language shifted subtly. The monarch was portrayed as misled or distracted. The woman was portrayed as influence itself. Responsibility condensed around her presence. Condensation protected structure. By attributing disruption to a single figure, the broader hierarchy remained stable. Reform was unnecessary if the fault lay in individual excess. Removal of the individual restored the appearance of balance. This mechanism repeated across households and courts. A husband might recover reputation after impropriety. A woman rarely did. Her name could become shorthand for scandal. Her relatives might experience diminished opportunity. Her authority narrowed to one dimension. The divergence shaped behavior. Women connected to power learned restraint. They calculated gestures carefully. They understood that tolerance extended only so far. Visibility invited scrutiny. Men learned a different lesson. Their authority provided resilience. They might face opposition or criticism, yet institutional backing remained. Law and inheritance sustained their position even amid controversy. Thus, identical intimacy generated unequal aftermath. The court accepted this pattern not because it was hidden, but because it aligned with expectation. Discipline was demanded of women as proof of order. Indulgence in men was contextualized as a privilege of rank. The mistress existed at the intersection of admiration and suspicion. She might be admired privately for influence, yet criticized publicly for the same reason. Praise remained conditional. Blame remained swift. Her proximity to authority magnified the disparity. If policy faltered, critics could argue that personal distraction weakened governance. If appointments appeared controversial, whispers might suggest undue persuasion. The monarch retained command. She absorbed reproach. The difference did not require a formal decree. It emerged from custom. Custom held greater force than written rule in many circumstances. It shaped interpretation before evidence entered the discussion. Once perception solidified, reversal proved difficult. In moments of crisis, society chooses where to focus. Correction. Correction rarely targeted the sovereign directly. It targeted those whose removal promised symbolic cleansing. A woman could be dismissed, relocated, or married elsewhere to restore the image without destabilizing the throne. Her departure signaled moral renewal. The monarch's authority remained intact. The repetition of this pattern normalized inequality. It trained observers to expect divergent consequences. It instructed families to calculate risk differently for sons and daughters. It also exposed the fragility of influence without structure. A mistress could participate in political conversation. She could affect the mood and outcome. Yet, when accountability arrived, she stood alone. The asymmetry served the preservation of hierarchy. By sustaining male authority while isolating female transgression, the court maintained continuity. Disruption was absorbed without systemic change. This dynamic extended beyond individual cases. It reflected a broader alignment between gender and power. Action alone did not determine destiny. Position did. In Tudor England, identical behavior did not guarantee identical judgment. The scale tilted before evaluation began. The same act left a man's authority untouched while unraveling a woman's standing. Blame drifted toward the figure easiest to sacrifice without disturbing the throne. Within a hierarchy determined to protect itself, consequences attached less to conduct than to vulnerability. Reputation in Tudor England did not depend solely on documented records. It travelled through corridors, across banquet table, through servants' quarters, and into neighbouring households long before ink touched parchment. Speech functioned as currency, and rumour functioned as transmission. A single comment could migrate through ranks within hours. No printing press was required for distortion. Memory reshaped tone. Retelling adjusted emphasis. By the time a story reached distant ears, it no longer resembled its origin. Speed favoured suspicion. Facts required verification. Rumours required only interest. In a court attentive to hierarchy, any suggestion of impropriety attracted attention immediately. The mere possibility of scandal provided enough energy for repetition. The mistress occupied especially vulnerable ground within this environment. Her proximity to authority ensured visibility. Her lack of legal foundation ensured fragility. If whispers questioned her character, defense required credibility she might not fully possess. Intentional distortion often accompanies ambition. Rivals understood that undermining reputation could achieve what confrontation could not. Rather than challenge influence directly, they seeded doubt. Doubt weakened support quietly. Without spectacle, a word placed carefully could achieve a disproportionate effect. It might suggest favoritism. It might imply manipulation. It might question loyalty. None of these accusations required proof to operate. Repetition granted plausibility. Servants played a significant role in transmission. They moved between chambers, carrying information both mundane and consequential. A fragment overheard near a doorway might reappear in the kitchen, embellished with speculation. From there, it travelled outward into the broader network of households. The boundary between observation and invention blurred easily. Those who benefited from rumours rarely identified themselves as their origin. Responsibility diffused. Attribution became impossible. Reputation eroded gradually, often without an identifiable source. Gradual erosion proved more effective than sudden scandal. A dramatic accusation invited scrutiny. Persistent whispering altered perception subtly. Over time, certainty replaced inquiry. What began as a question transformed into an assumed truth. The mistress could attempt correction. She might demonstrate composure publicly. She might distance herself from controversy. Yet the rebuttal risked reinforcing attention. Silence risked appearing guilty. This dilemma intensified vulnerability. Public speech required caution. Private speech required trust. Trust could not be guaranteed in a competitive court. Families connected to her monitored narrative closely. They understood that marriage prospects, appointments, and alliances depended on perception. A damaged name affected more than one individual. It influenced generations. Rumour thus functioned as a political instrument. It redistributed power without a formal decree. It could isolate an individual while preserving the appearance of civility. Those spreading doubt often claimed neutrality, framing themselves as concerned observers rather than aggressors. Concern disguised strategy. The Tudor court prized reputation because reputation underpinned legitimacy. A sovereign's image required maintenance. So did the image of those near him. If the mistress's presence threatened public confidence, narrative adjustment followed swiftly. Adjustment did not require evidence. It required repetition. Courtiers rarely challenged circulating stories unless they possessed compelling reasons. Challenging rumour risked association. Safer to observe, recalibrate, and wait for the outcome. Over time, perception hardened into history. Records reflected prevailing interpretation rather than original complexity. Chroniclers adopted the language already familiar. Subsequent generations inherited simplified portraits. The transformation from living person to symbolic caution occurred almost imperceptibly. A woman who once influenced discussion became a footnote defined by scandal. Nuance vanished. Motive condensed into a stereotype. This process revealed the fragility of informal power. Influence acquired through intimacy lacked protective documentation. It existed in conversation and memory. Once memory turned hostile, protection diminished rapidly. The mistress learned to measure words carefully. A careless comment could echo far beyond its intention. Even laughter at the wrong moment might be recast as mockery. Every gesture acquired interpretive potential. The court's appetite for narrative ensured continuity of this dynamic. Ambition required tools. Speech provided one of the most accessible. No weapons needed. No formal accusation required. Reputation could be dismantled quietly. This quiet dismantling often proved irreversible. By the time truth surfaced, belief had settled. The correction lacked drama. The initial rumour carried greater appeal. Within Tudor society, where hierarchy depended upon image, spoken distortion operated as a subtle force shaping destiny. It determined alliances. It influenced the appointment. It prepared the ground for removal. A whisper did not need to be loud to be lethal. It required only repetition. Rumour travelled faster than evidence and settled more firmly than truth. Reputation could be altered deliberately, without confrontation or proof. A single whisper, repeated often enough, possessed the power to close doors that would never reopen. Alliances in Tudor England rarely dissolved with ceremony. They unravelled quietly. Often, at the precise moment they became inconvenient. What once appeared advantageous could transform into a liability without warning. A family that had encouraged intimacy with power might begin to reassess its calculation. Proximity promised advancement, but it also attracted scrutiny. When the favour weakened, the cost of association rose sharply. Self-preservation replaced ambition. Relatives who once celebrated connection might retreat into caution. Conversations shifted tone. Invitations diminished. Correspondence slowed. Distance created protection. The mistress stood at the centre of this transition. While favour endured, she embodied opportunity. Her presence opened doors. Her access signalled potential. Families invested reputational capital in that access. When favour faltered, perception shifted immediately. What had been described as influence could be reinterpreted as imprudence. What had been called loyalty could be reframed as manipulation. The same relationship acquired a different language. Language preceded withdrawal. A family rarely declared abandonment openly. Instead, it adjusted behavior subtly. Public association decreased. Support grew conditional. Emphasis moved toward independent identity rather than shared advancement. Political calculation governed the shift. If rivals gained strength, continued alignment with the mistress risked collateral damage. To preserve estates, marriages, and titles, distance became necessary. Affection yielded to strategy. The monarch's attention proved an unstable foundation. Its warmth secured opportunity. Its absence exposed vulnerability. Families aware of this fragility hedged their investments carefully. Yet hedging often meant sacrifice. The mistress herself bore the visible consequence of shifting alliances. She could not relocate blame outward easily. Her identity remained tied to intimacy. If the relationship became controversial, her relatives might frame it as her personal misjudgment rather than a collective decision. This framing protected lineage. It separated ambition from responsibility. The family could argue that it had not sought influence aggressively. It could portray itself as a surprise participant rather than an architect. Such narratives required credibility. Public distancing reinforced them. Reduced contact suggested disapproval. Silence implied moral correction. The family's survival depended upon convincing observers that it prioritized order over attachment. Meanwhile, favor transformed from an asset to a burden. Association with the monarch's indulgence might invite resentment. If political tension intensified, the mistress could be portrayed as a symbol of excess. Those linked to her risked being drawn into criticism. Withdrawal, therefore, appeared prudent. Prudence rarely resembled loyalty. The mistress might sense the change before it became explicit. Fewer relatives visited. Fewer petitions arrived. Encouragement diminished. Concern replaced confidence. Isolation followed gradually. Her influence weakened, not only because royal attention shifted, but also because familial backing thinned. Support structures that once amplified her presence now dissolved. In moments of heightened controversy, sacrifice occurred more abruptly. A scandal might erupt. Policy might falter. Opponents might demand correction. Removing the mistress offered a symbolic resolution without destabilizing sovereign authority. Families often complied silently. They recognized that resistance endangered more than one individual. By allowing her removal to proceed unchallenged, they preserved broader security. Personal attachment could not compete with dynastic survival. The mistress became expendable. Expendability did not imply insignificance. It revealed the hierarchy of priority. Estates, titles, and succession outweighed individual fortune. Publicly, her departure might be framed as a moral realignment. Privately, it signaled a recalibration of the alliance. The court observed and adjusted accordingly. Those who once courted her favor redirected allegiance swiftly. Ambition did not tolerate vacancy. Influence migrated toward safer proximity. The speed of transition exposed the transactional nature of many relationships. Affection might have existed. Genuine loyalty might have accompanied the strategy. Yet, when pressure intensified, preservation governed response. The mistress confronted the stark asymmetry of her position. She had embodied a conduit for advancement. Once that conduit ceased to function, those who benefited most from it retreated first. This retreat did not erase history. It reinterpreted it. What had been celebrated as an advantageous alliance became a cautionary tale. The narrative shifted to emphasize excess rather than utility. Responsibility condensed around her identity. Within Tudor society, alliance was never purely personal. It operated within a matrix of calculation. When the advantage dissolved, attachment weakened. The failure of the alliance revealed underlying priorities clearly. Family endured. Titles endured. She did not. An alliance that once promised advancement could unravel the moment it threatened stability. Families distanced themselves to preserve their estates and reputation. In a court governed by survival, the mistress often became the necessary sacrifice that restored balance. Punishment in Tudor England did not always arrive with proclamation. It could unfold without trial, without accusation, formally read aloud, without any written decree. Removal itself functioned as a sentence. A mistress who had once moved freely through corridors might suddenly find doors closed. Invitations ceased without explanation. Guards offered polite resistance rather than greeting. Access, once taken for granted, disappeared gradually. Exclusion required no spectacle. The court continued its rhythm. Councils met. Banquets were arranged. Ceremonies proceeded with measured dignity. Her absence became the only indication that something had changed. Public removal represented the most visible form of correction. To be denied entry to royal chambers signalled definitive withdrawal of favour. Courtiers observed closely. They recalibrated allegiance instantly. The distance from her became a demonstration of prudence. Yet not all punishment announced itself so clearly. A quieter mechanism operated alongside exclusion. Marriage could be arranged swiftly, framed as an opportunity rather than a compulsion. A suitable husband might be identified in a distant region. The arrangement appeared generous on the surface. Generosity concealed strategy. Marriage redirected attention. It relocated the mistress geographically and symbolically. Her intimacy with power became a past narrative rather than a present concern. The problem resolved itself without confrontation. She might accept the arrangement without resistance. Refusal risked harsher consequences. Compliance offered preservation of dignity, albeit diminished. Her new role often required silence regarding previous proximity. Silence reinforced hierarchy. The marriage did not restore influence. It neutralized it. By placing her within a conventional domestic structure, the court reframed her identity as wife rather than confidant. Social isolation could operate even without relocation. Former allies reduced correspondence. Invitations to gatherings disappeared. Conversations grew cautious. She might remain physically near the court, yet experience an absence of engagement. Isolation rarely needs explanation. It functioned as a collective decision without formal coordination. Each individual calculated the benefit independently. Avoidance became common behavior. The cumulative effect proved decisive. Without a network, influence collapsed. Without presence, the narrative shifted. Observers interpreted distance as confirmation of wrongdoing, even if no accusation had been voiced. Reputation adjusted accordingly. Official punishment, when applied, offered clarity at least. Charges might be articulated, penalties specified, yet many cases never reached that stage. Informal mechanisms achieved the desired outcome efficiently. Efficiency protected authority. The monarch avoided the appearance of instability. The court avoided spectacle. The system corrected itself without visible rupture. Punishment thus appeared both gentle and severe. No imprisonment might occur. No confiscation might be declared. Yet loss of access, reputation, and protection amounted to profound displacement. The mistress's vulnerability lay precisely in this ambiguity. She possessed no formal title, guaranteeing presence. No documented role ensured participation. Her authority depended entirely on continued favour. Once the favour was withdrawn, no appeal existed. Appeal required recognition. Without a recognised status, the grievance lacked an audience. A dismissed councillor might protest before peers. A removed noble might petition through family networks. A mistress lacked a comparable institutional pathway. Her recourse was personal resilience. Some retreated into quiet domestic life. Others attempted to rebuild alliances discreetly. A few disappeared from record almost entirely. The speed with which punishment unfolded revealed preparation. Rivals often anticipated opportunity. Once signs of fading favour emerged, Alternative alliances solidified quickly. The court structure left little room for hesitation. Formal censure, when employed, carried symbolic weight. It reassured observers that morality remained intact. It reinforced the message that deviation would not be tolerated indefinitely, even if male authority escaped direct consequence. Visible correction restored the appearance of order. The asymmetry remained consistent. The monarch's conduct might be contextualized as a lapse. The woman's presence could be framed as a catalyst. Removing her offered closure without destabilizing sovereign legitimacy. This pattern required no written statute. It relied on expectation. Expectation functioned as a social contract stronger than law in many circumstances. Everyone understood the consequences without needing them articulated. Public memory participated in enforcement. Stories circulated, explaining removal as a necessary purification. The mistress's earlier influence diminished in narrative significance. She became an example rather than an actor. Example served instruction. Young women, observing court dynamics, learned boundaries. Families calculating advancement reconsidered risk. The lesson was transmitted without proclamation. In this way, punishment extended beyond the individual. It reinforced system. The absence of spectacle often intensified severity. No opportunity for defense existed. No dramatic reversal occurred. The transition from prominence to obscurity felt seamless. Seamlessness masked intentionality. Decisions had been made. Calculations completed. Alliances reconsidered. The outcome appeared natural, as though circumstances alone dictated change. The mistress's earlier visibility made her disappearance more striking. Courtiers who once sought her presence redirected attention swiftly. The court adjusted without pause. Life resumed its rhythm. Yet beneath routine, a message had been delivered. Influence without foundation remained temporary. Proximity without protection remained fragile. The mechanisms of punishment, exclusion, forced marriage, and social isolation operated quietly but effectively. They required no public condemnation to achieve a lasting effect. They preserved hierarchy without inviting instability. In Tudor England, correction rarely disrupted structure. It removed elements deemed expendable and restored equilibrium through silence. The mistress often stood as that element. Punishment in the Tudor court did not always require trial or decree. Removal itself was sufficient. Exclusion, arranged marriage, and silent isolation dissolved influence without spectacle. Through these quiet mechanisms, the court preserved order while ensuring that vulnerability carried unmistakable consequence. Loss in the Tudor court did not always announce itself with accusation. It could arrive in the form of absence. No summons was delivered. No indictment was read. The chamber simply continued without her. The court possessed many rooms. Yet, access defined existence. To be admitted signaled relevance. To be excluded signaled a conclusion. When a name no longer appeared on invitation lists, meaning required, no explanation was required. No tribunal assembled to weigh evidence. No witnesses were called to testify. No parchment recorded formal wrongdoing. Silence carried the decision. At first, the change might appear minor. A banquet passed without her presence. An evening gathering proceeded without notice. A procession advanced in which she did not walk. Each omission seemed temporary. Temporary omissions accumulated. Courtiers observed. They noted who attended and who did not. They understood that absence rarely occurred by accident. Patterns revealed intention. Doors that once opened promptly began to close. A chamberlain offered polite regret. A guard suggested a misunderstanding. A servant hesitated before admitting entry. The hesitation itself communicated adjustment. In the Tudor hierarchy, access equaled recognition. Without recognition, influence evaporated. Her belongings might remain in familiar quarters. Her garments might hang undisturbed. Yet without invitation, Those objects lost significance. Presence without participation proved hollow. The palace did not need to expel her physically to effect removal. Social withdrawal achieved the same result with greater discretion. The court's rhythm resumed, as if nothing had changed. Absence rarely provoked confrontation. To demand an explanation would require acknowledgement that exclusion existed. A mistress lacked standing to compel such acknowledgement. She could not summon the council to debate her fate. Her departure, therefore, unfolded gradually. One evening without invitation became two. Weeks passed without summons. Correspondence thinned. Messages once delivered urgently arrived slowly, then ceased. No one declared punishment. Yet the consequence manifested unmistakably. Alliances recalibrated swiftly. Those who had depended on her proximity redirected ambition toward new centers of favor. Distance became a demonstration of prudence. Association with the decline risked contamination. Contamination did not require proof. It required perception. The court's collective instinct favored stability. If removing her restored equilibrium, few questioned the necessity. Moral language might be invoked privately, but public narrative remained restrained. Restraint concealed severity. The absence of a formal accusation deprived her of a defense. She could not refute a charge never articulated. She could not appeal to mercy for an offense never specified. Ambiguity intensified isolation. Without clarity, she could not calculate the response. Was her removal a temporary displeasure or a permanent decision? Silence offered no guidance. In that silence, reputation hardened. Observers interpreted exclusion as confirmation of a misstep. Rumors attached easily to the vacancy. Stories circulated explaining her disappearance in terms that justified it. Justification protected structure. The monarch's authority remained intact. The court's order remained visible. The removal appeared to be a natural adjustment rather than a disruption. Yet for the individual, adjustment meant erasure. Her name faded from conversation. Her former influence is reduced to memory. The same corridors that once carried her footsteps echoed without them. The permanence of closing doors defined finality. A palace gate might remain physically open, but social passage had ended. Entry without welcome equaled intrusion. Familiar spaces became inaccessible. Time reinforced the outcome. As weeks extended into months, her absence ceased to surprise. New figures occupied visible positions. The court normalized the change quickly. Normalization rendered reversal unlikely. Without a crisis to prompt reconsideration, restoration remained improbable. The mistress's existence within that sphere became chapter concluded. The mechanism required no violence. It relied on collective withdrawal. Collective withdrawal functioned efficiently because it appeared voluntary. No single actor assumed responsibility. Each individual adjusted according to perceived direction. Direction originated from favor. When favor withdrew, the system responded reflexively. No proclamation necessary. The quiet nature of this loss distinguished it from a dramatic downfall. A dramatic fall invited sympathy. Quiet disappearance invited resignation. Without spectacle, memory faded more easily. For the mistress, the realization arrived gradually. The absence of summons confirmed permanence. The door that once opened effortlessly remained closed. The life defined by proximity dissolved without a formal farewell. This form of punishment served the hierarchy effectively. It corrected the imbalance without destabilizing the throne. It removed vulnerability without challenging authority. It restored visible order through invisibility. In Tudor England, condemnation did not always require a voice. Silence sufficed. The court preserved its rhythm. The monarch retained sovereignty. She remained outside. No trial was convened, and no charge was read aloud. Yet the outcome proved absolute. Absence replaced accusation, and silence replaced verdict. A court that could withdraw recognition without explanation demonstrated how easily a life could be erased without a single public word. Not all mistresses in Tudor England occupied the same ground. Even if they stood within similar proximity to power, birth determined more than education or refinement ever could. It defined protection, expectation, and consequence long before intimacy entered the equation. A noblewoman who became a mistress did not arrive empty-handed. She carried lineage. She carried alliances. She carried the implicit protection of a family whose interests extended beyond her personal fortune. Her proximity to authority might be controversial, but it was rarely invisible. Relatives positioned in court offices could advocate quietly on her behalf. Brothers, uncles, and cousins might already possess estates or titles. If favour fluctuated, she had somewhere to return. Return offered stability. A noble family might recalibrate strategy without discarding her entirely. Marriage could be arranged to restore respectability. Dowry could secure an alliance. Her reputation, though strained, could be recontextualized. The system absorbed her more easily. Her upbringing in courtly behavior also mattered. She understood ceremony, etiquette, and restraint. Her conduct aligned outwardly with expectations of refinement. Even in controversy, she maintained composure that reassured observers. Observers interpreted refinement as legitimacy. Legitimacy softened judgment. The common-born mistress inhabited a different terrain. She did not possess ancestral estates to shield her. She lacked influential kin positioned to negotiate the outcome. Her rise depended almost entirely on favour itself. If favour withdrew, she faced an abrupt descent. Without family leverage, she could not redirect the narrative easily. Marriage prospects diminished sharply once the association with the scandal emerged. Employment within noble households became unlikely. Isolation struck harder. A noblewoman might retreat to a countryside estate. A common-born woman might confront poverty. Her livelihood depended on continued acceptance that rarely endured. Public scrutiny also diverged. When a noble mistress entered court, observers framed her involvement within the context of politics and alliance. Her participation could be interpreted as strategic. When a common woman gained proximity, suspicion emphasized ambition or impropriety. Language revealed hierarchy. The same intimacy described as influence in one woman might be described as presumption in another. Tone shifted subtly, yet impact differed profoundly. Protection extended unevenly. A noble family could negotiate a discreet relocation if tension intensified. They could absorb scandal within broader prestige. A common-born mistress lacked comparable cushioning. Her name alone carried the weight of accusation. Risk is multiplied accordingly. If controversy erupted, she became an easy target for moral outrage. Her removal satisfied the expectation of correction swiftly. Few voices advocated for nuance. Advancement also reflected disparity. A noble mistress might secure offices for relatives or patronage for allies. Her network amplified the benefit. A common-born woman possessed a narrower capacity to distribute favour. Even if she influenced appointments, recipients rarely matched the scale of noble alliances. Scale determined endurance. The court tolerated noble ambition more readily because it aligned with existing power structures. Common ambition appeared disruptive. Disruption invited suppression. Social mobility existed in Tudor England, but it remained conditional. A common-born mistress who ascended too visibly threatened the established hierarchy. Her rise could inspire resentment beyond moral critique. Resentment accelerated the decline. Noble birth provided insulation against abrupt erasure. Common birth exposes vulnerability from the outset. Every gesture carried greater scrutiny. Education reinforced difference. Noble women were trained in rhetoric, music, and diplomatic comportment. They understood how to navigate a conversation with restraint. A common-born mistress, however intelligent, might lack identical training in courtly subtlety. Subtlety preserved influence. Without it, misinterpretation increased. A careless remark could reinforce the stereotype of impropriety. A visible display of confidence could be framed as arrogance. The court's reaction depended not only on behavior, but on expectation. Expectation favored those already situated within the hierarchy. It distrusted those who appeared to cross boundaries too boldly. Yet vulnerability persisted even among noble women. Birth did not eliminate risk, it moderated consequence. A noble mistress could still be removed, still lose influence, still experience isolation. The difference lay in the aftermath. Aftermath for a noble woman meant recalibration. Aftermath for a common-born woman meant survival. Survival required resource without guarantee. The distinction underscored how deeply class shaped protection. Moral rhetoric applied broadly, but enforcement varied according to status. The Tudor court functioned through a visible hierarchy. Even in intimacy, hierarchy remained intact. The mistress's fate was not determined solely by affection or scandal. It was filtered through birth. Birth determined access to rescue. It determined the scale of the fall. Thus, two women might share proximity to the same sovereign and experience entirely different trajectories. One could re-enter society with diminished but intact standing. The other might vanish from the record entirely. The difference did not require formal acknowledgement. It operated silently. Like many Tudor mechanisms, noble birth offered insulation that softened consequence. While common origin intensified vulnerability, advancement proved more attainable for those already anchored within the hierarchy. In a court governed by rank as much as desire, the social status determined not only opportunity, but the severity of fall. Religion in Tudor England did not stand apart from politics. It shaped language, expectation, and judgment long before any scandal emerged. Doctrine defined virtue. Virtue defined order. Order sustained hierarchy. Faith was not private reflection alone. It was an instruction repeated from the pulpit to the parish. Sermons emphasized obedience within marriage. Fidelity was presented not merely as personal choice, but as a sacred obligation. The household mirrored divine design. Within that design, the woman occupied symbolic ground. She embodied purity. She represented submission. Her conduct signified stability. The lawful wife, therefore, aligned with the theological ideal. Her fidelity reinforced the spiritual narrative. Deviation from that ideal carried more than personal consequences. It threatened alignment between household and doctrine. If a woman is associated with intimacy outside marriage, the act could be interpreted as a fracture within the sacred structure. The interpretation extended beyond private conduct. The mistress stood in an ambiguous space. Her existence was tolerated in practice, yet contradicted moral proclamation. The court accommodated complexity, but the pulpit did not soften instruction. Instruction demanded discipline. Clergy reminded congregations that marital unity reflected divine covenant. The language of sin carried weight. It attaches to bodies more readily than to offices. Gender shaped the application. A sovereign might be admonished privately for indulgence. His authority remained divinely sanctioned. The woman involved, however, risked becoming an emblem of temptation. Temptation required correction. Correction could manifest through removal or condemnation. Religious language is justified without the need for detailed inquiry. The act alone sufficed. Society internalized this framework. Communities repeated sermons in domestic conversation. Mothers instructed daughters about modesty. Conduct became a marker of spiritual worth. Reputation is intertwined with salvation. The mistress's vulnerability deepened within this environment. If her intimacy became public knowledge, it could be framed as moral contagion. Her presence at court might be described as evidence of spiritual decay. The language intensified quickly. Decay implied danger, not only to the personal soul, but to the collective order. In a period marked by religious upheaval and reform, stability appeared fragile. Moral transgression could be interpreted as a symptom of a broader disorder. Thus, Her conduct acquired disproportionate symbolic value. She did not merely represent herself. She represented breach. The lawful wife's image reinforced the doctrine. The mistress's image appeared to contradict it. Even if the monarch's behavior mirrored hers, his status shielded him from identical framing. Shielding preserved hierarchy. Divine right fortified sovereignty. Female virtue fortified the household. When tension arose, female virtue absorbed scrutiny first. Religious reform movements amplified sensitivity. Shifts between Catholic and Protestant doctrine created heightened awareness of moral discipline. Public demonstration of virtue became a political statement. The court could not ignore appearance. Appearance often outweighed nuance. If removing a mistress restored moral narrative, the decision aligned conveniently with theological expectation. Authority appeared repentant without sacrificing sovereign power. Repentance did not always require confession. Symbolic correction sufficed. The mistress might never face a formal ecclesiastical trial, yet moral language circulated regardless. Sermons, referencing temptation or corruption, resonated pointedly within court circles. Resonance reinforced distance. Courtiers, attentive to public sentiment, adjusted accordingly. Association with perceived immorality risked reputational damage. Religion thus shaped political behavior indirectly. Indirect influence proved effective. No bishop needed to issue a decree against a specific individual. The framework of sin and virtue already operated within consciousness. The tension between lived practice and proclaimed morality remained persistent. The court navigated complexity quietly. Clergy proclaimed clarity loudly. Between those spheres, the mistress bore a disproportionate burden. Her removal could be framed as moral restoration. Her isolation could be interpreted as a spiritual necessity, even if political calculation drove the outcome. Religious vocabulary legitimized it. Legitimization strengthened stability. The Tudor state intertwined the crown and the church closely. Moral narrative supported political continuity. Correction of visible deviation reassured the public that the order endured. Within this arrangement, the mistress stood exposed. Her intimacy, though influential, lacked sacred sanction. Without sanction, protection weakened. Religious doctrine did not recognize the nuance of power dynamics. It recognized the boundary. Boundary defined righteousness. To cross it invited consequences. The intersection of theology and gender shaped destiny decisively. The lawful wife embodied the covenant. The mistress embodied deviation. The sovereign embodied authority. Authority endured. Deviation did not. Religion did not invent political vulnerability, but it intensified it. It framed personal intimacy as a moral threat and supplied language through which correction appeared necessary. In Tudor England, sin functioned as both a spiritual concept and a political instrument. The mistress lived within that overlap. Religious doctrine defined fidelity as a sacred duty and aligned female virtue with social stability. Any deviation could be framed as a threat not only to marriage, but to divine order. In a court bound tightly to spiritual language, moral judgment became a powerful mechanism, reinforcing hierarchy and determining fate. A mistress in the Tudor court did not always remain an individual. Under pressure, she could become something larger than herself. Her name could detach from her daily actions and attach instead to the fate of an entire reign. Political opponents required symbols. Policy disagreements proved complex and difficult to explain to broader audiences. Economic strain, military setbacks, or diplomatic tension demanded narratives simple enough to travel easily. A visible woman near the throne provided such simplicity. Her presence could be reframed as evidence. If finances faltered, critics might suggest indulgence, distracted governance. If foreign negotiations stumbled, whispers might imply undue influence within private chambers. The complexity of statecraft condensed into personal proximity. Condensation served strategy. It allowed opponents to challenge authority indirectly. Rather than accuse the monarch of incompetence, they could criticize the environment around him. The mistress became the embodiment of perceived decline. Embodiment simplified blame. She stood as a tangible representation of excess or corruption. Her image could circulate in conversation more easily than abstract policy failure. Symbol travelled faster than analysis. Language sharpened accordingly. Pamphlets, private letters, and court gossip might describe her as a catalyst for moral decay. Even if no evidence connected her directly to specific decisions, association sufficed to build a narrative. Narrative shaped perception. Perception influenced allegiance. Those dissatisfied with governance found in her a focal point. Criticism, directed at her, appeared less dangerous than a direct attack on sovereign authority. Thus, she absorbed political frustration that might otherwise destabilize the throne. This absorption functioned as containment. By concentrating resentment upon a single figure, the system protected its core. Removal of that figure could then be presented as a correction, preserving the broader structure. The process required repetition. Each mention of her name alongside the decline reinforced the connection. Over time, the linkage seemed inevitable rather than constructed. Her individuality receded. Personal qualities, to intelligence, restraint, and loyalty became irrelevant to the narrative. She transformed into a symbol, and symbols operate differently from persons. Symbol does not require nuance. It requires recognizability. Opponents exploited that recognizability. They framed her attire, her gestures, even her silence, as signs of influence beyond the rightful boundary. The court's fascination with her proximity fueled the very narratives that endangered her. Visual presence intensified vulnerability. To be seen frequently beside authority invited interpretation. The more prominent her appearance, the easier to suggest she shaped events. Such a suggestion rarely faced direct rebuttal. To defend her publicly risked a legitimizing accusation. Silence allowed rumor to expand unchallenged. Either response carried risk. Political tension amplified symbolic usage. During crises, audiences seek an explanation quickly. Blaming structural complexity satisfies few. Blaming a visible figure satisfies many. The mistress thus became shorthand for dissatisfaction. A failing harvest could not be attributed to her directly. Yet frustration might still attach to perceived moral disorder at court. The connection required no logic, only emotional resonance. Resonance sustained criticism. Once embedded, the symbol endured beyond immediate controversy. Chroniclers might adopt language already circulating, embedding association into the record. Record solidified interpretation. Generations later, her name might appear beside decline, as though the connection had been factual rather than rhetorical. The initial strategy achieved permanence. This permanence obscured intention. The political motives behind her symbolic construction faded. The symbol remained intact, detached from its original context. Within Tudor politics, visibility equaled opportunity, but also exposure. The mistress's proximity to power granted influence, yet rendered her susceptible to appropriation. Her identity could be reshaped to serve agendas she did not control. Control resided elsewhere. Those crafting narratives operated with strategic intent. They understood that attacking an image often proved safer than attacking the throne. The monarch's authority benefited from this dynamic as well. If dissatisfaction grew, allowing symbolic blame to accumulate around a mistress provided an outlet without structural reform. Her removal might signal renewal. Renewal reinforced legitimacy. The public perceived the action taken. Authority appeared responsive. Underlying policies remained unchanged. The mistress's transformation into a symbol thus fulfilled a dual function. It empowered opponents to critique indirectly. It enabled the throne to absorb criticism safely. Her personal experience within this process often remained undocumented. Records emphasized scandal, not circumstance. They preserved accusation more readily than defense. In this way, political utility outlived personal presence. She might depart the court, yet the symbol persisted. Her name continued to represent decline or corruption long after context disappeared. The court's structure encouraged such transformation. Hierarchy required stability. Symbols facilitated adjustment without upheaval. The mistress, by virtue of her proximity and vulnerability, provided convenient material. Her identity could be recast as evidence of decay, allowing critics to challenge a reign without confronting its ruler directly. Personal presence became political shorthand, and nuance dissolved into accusation. Once transformed into a symbol, she carried the weight of collective frustration far beyond her own actions. A political crisis in Tudor England rarely announced its full complexity to the public. War, famine, failed alliances, and financial strain emerged from layered causes that few outside the council chamber fully understood. Yet explanation demanded simplicity. Within that demand, a single woman could become sufficient, her name attached easily to failure. If negotiations collapsed, whispers suggested distraction. If taxation angered the populace, murmurs hinted at indulgence within the palace. If foreign powers gained an advantage, critics pointed toward the influence of private affection. The association required no documentation. It required repetition. A court uneasy with instability sought visible anchors for blame. Abstract miscalculation did not satisfy public imagination. A living figure did. The mistress stood available. Her proximity to authority provided narrative convenience. She could be portrayed as the reason decisions were delayed, altered, or softened, even when events unfolded independently of her presence. Linkage appeared persuasive. Persuasion operated through suggestion. No council record might mention her. No policy draft might reflect her advice. Yet the story circulated that she had shaped the outcome through intimacy. That suggestion proved sufficient for many. Failure condensed into personhood. Condensation transformed complexity into a moral lesson. The crisis ceased to represent systemic strain and instead embodied the consequence of private indulgence. This embodiment protected sovereignty. To admit structural weakness risked questioning governance itself. To attribute decline to a single influence preserved the image of otherwise sound authority. Removing the influence signaled correction. Correction reassured observers. If a woman could be dismissed, the crisis appeared manageable. The narrative implied that order would return once improper presence vanished. In this process, her individuality diminished further. Her intelligence, restraint, or limitations no longer mattered. She represented a cause rather than a participant. Her life narrowed into explanation. History absorbed this narrowing readily. Chroniclers favored decisive stories. They linked downturns to personalities. A reign remembered for difficulty might include her name as a defining factor. Even if archival evidence remained ambiguous, ambiguity rarely survives retelling. Retelling demanded clarity. Clarity often required villain. The mistress, lacking institutional defense, occupied that role efficiently. She could not publish a rebuttal. She could not convene a tribunal to examine evidence. Her removal silenced her. Silence allowed interpretation to harden. Once her name aligned with the crisis, repetition entrenched it. Subsequent accounts relied on earlier narratives. The connection between women and failure acquired inevitability. Inevitability obscured context. Economic hardship resulting from harvest failure could be reframed as evidence of divine displeasure toward moral laxity at court. Military defeat could be described as punishment for distraction. The linkage felt coherent within the prevailing moral framework. Coherence overshadowed accuracy. The crisis might have arisen from diplomatic miscalculation, insufficient resources, or broader European tension. Yet assigning responsibility to a visible woman satisfied the expectation of order disrupted by intimacy. Expectation shaped memory. Future generations, encountering simplified accounts, encountered her name first. They encountered a suggestion of undue influence before understanding policy debate. Understanding requires patience. Narrative requires only emphasis. Within Tudor culture, where hierarchy intertwined with moral language, the transformation from companion to scapegoat unfolded smoothly. The mistress's removal appeared as an act of renewal. The underlying crisis might persist, yet symbolism suggested resolution. Resolution seldom matched reality, yet the symbolic act carried political value. It demonstrated responsiveness without conceding structural weakness. The woman's fate thus extended beyond personal consequence. She became a cautionary example in discourse about governance. Her story warned against excess, against intimacy perceived as improper, against influence exercised outside formal authority. Her memory served as instruction. Instruction benefited the system more than the individual. As years passed, records condensed further. Her motivations disappeared. Her relationships simplified. She emerged in historical narrative as an emblem of downfall. Downfall required face. Her face provided one. The fragility of this position lay in its permanence. Once inscribed as a catalyst for crisis, her name resisted rehabilitation. Even scholars attempting nuance confronted entrenched interpretation. Entrenchment illustrated the power of early narrative. A single period of instability could define her entire remembrance. The complexity of court politics faded behind a convenient explanation. Thus, a woman who once navigated corridors with calculated caution might be remembered not for her conduct, but for failures she did not design. The transformation from participant to cause occurred gradually yet decisively. The political crisis demanded clarity. Clarity demanded a symbol. She supplied it. A complex crisis could be distilled into one recognizable name, allowing authority to preserve its dignity. Failures born of policy or circumstance were redirected toward her presence. In the record that endured, she was remembered less as an individual than as a convenient explanation for turmoil far beyond her control. The removal of a mistress from court did not end the consequences of her proximity to power. Influence might fade quickly, but association endures. The echo of her presence extended outward, settling upon those who shared her name. Children felt the weight first, even when they had played no role in their mother's choices. Their lineage carried a memory of scandal. Prospective guardians, tutors, or patrons considered the background carefully. Questions surfaced quietly during negotiations. Background shaped opportunity. A child born into a noble lineage might still encounter hesitation if that lineage carried a controversial history. Marriage discussions slowed. Alliances recalculated risk. Families measured not only wealth and title, but also reputation. Reputation proved persistent. It lingered in correspondence, in whispered recollection, in cautionary remarks made during social gatherings. A single association could shadow multiple generations. For daughters, the effect often appeared most sharply. Marriage represented stability and advancement. Yet families seeking alliance examined public memory closely. A connection to a scandal suggested unpredictability. Even unfounded suspicion altered calculation. Calculation favored caution. Better to align with unblemished lineage than to invite potential controversy. Thus, advantageous matches slipped quietly beyond reach. Sons encountered different but related constraints. They might pursue a military commission or an administrative office. Yet endorsement from influential sponsors required confidence in family standing. A tainted name complicated the recommendation. Complication reduced advancement. Even if talent proved evident, hesitation remained. Advancement within the Tudor hierarchy relied as much on trust as merit. Trust depended on the perception of stability. Perception drew upon history. The mistress's removal might have satisfied the immediate crisis. Yet a narrative was attached permanently to the surname. That narrative travelled alongside her descendants. Relatives beyond immediate children also absorbed the impact. Cousins negotiating their own alliances encountered subtle resistance. Proposals met with a delay. Invitations diminished. Social distancing expanded gradually. Distance functioned as a quiet barrier. No public declaration of disapproval was necessary. Collective memory sufficed to signal caution. Families attempted mitigation. They emphasized service, loyalty, and devotion to the crown. They sought to reposition themselves through visible piety or strategic marriage elsewhere. Over time, some succeeded in diluting the association. Dilution required patience. Years passed before stigma softened. Even then, traces persisted in certain circles. The asymmetry of power intensified this effect. While the monarch's reputation often recovered swiftly, the mistress's family bore a longer shadow. Authority retained resilience. Vulnerable lineage did not. This imbalance revealed structural reality. Political systems that redirected blame toward individuals also redirected memory toward families. Responsibility expanded outward in social perception, even if it had been concentrated rhetorically during the crisis. Legacy thus became complicated. A family might have gained temporary advancement through association with power, yet the cost could outlast the benefit. Titles secured during favour might endure, but whispers accompanied them. Whispers influenced behaviour. Descendants might adopt heightened caution in conduct. They avoided visible ambition. They embraced conformity more strictly than their peers. Fear of repetition shaped choices. Fear constrained identity. Some descendants sought to erase the connection. They married into distant regions. They minimized mention of maternal lineage. Records grew sparse intentionally. Intentional forgetting proved difficult. History remained accessible in chronicles and letters. Scholars and rivals alike could revive a dormant association, if convenient. Thus, the legacy of a mistress rarely remained confined to her lifetime. It permeated genealogies, affected dowries, and influenced inheritance discussions. Estates, once expanded through favour, might shrink through cautious alliance. The broader community observed these outcomes. Other families contemplating similar proximity to power weighed potential gain against generational cost. The lesson endured quietly. Short-term elevation carried long-term uncertainty. In Tudor England, identity operated collectively. A woman's reputation is intertwined with that of her kin. The court's decision to remove her did not dissolve shared history. Shared history persisted across decades. Children born after her fall inherited not influence, but interpretation. They navigated society, conscious of the narrative preceding them. Narrative rarely distinguishes nuance. It preserved the most striking version of events. If scandal had once been associated with their name, that association resurfaced during moments of scrutiny. Scrutiny intensified during negotiation. Marriage contracts examined lineage carefully. Offices demanded endorsements. Each stage required examination of the background. Thus, the consequences of a mistress's rise and fall extended beyond individual ambition. They reshaped familial trajectory. Advancement might have seemed assured during favour, yet the same association that elevated could later obstruct. The family endured. The memory endured. The stigma endured longest. In Tudor society, where reputation functioned as currency, the inheritance of controversy proved burdensome. Children and relatives bore the weight not of their own actions, but of proximity once valued and later condemned. The fall of a mistress rarely ended with her departure from court. Her children and relatives carried the weight of an altered reputation long after favour had vanished. Across generations, memory proved more enduring than influence, shaping futures in ways no one could easily reverse. Power in Tudor England did not operate as a neutral force. It moved through a hierarchy structured long before any individual entered court. Within that structure, gender determined position as decisively as birth. Women did not enter the political space as autonomous actors. They entered as daughters, wives, or companions. Their identities were relational, even when proximity to authority granted influence. That influence lacked formal recognition. Recognition mattered, without title or office. A woman's role could be expanded or contracted without consultation. Her presence might serve a strategy, yet she remained excluded from acknowledgement of authorship. This exclusion preserved hierarchy. Men occupied offices defined by law and precedent. They held lands secured by inheritance. Their authority appeared institutional. Women's authority appeared incidental. Incidental authority could be used effectively. A mistress might facilitate alliance, soften opposition, or redirect discussion. Her influence could alter the outcome significantly. Yet the same system that benefited from her presence refused to legitimize it. Legitimacy would have disrupted order. Order depended on visible male governance. Allowing female influence to acquire formal recognition threatened the perception of stability. Therefore, her contribution remained informal. Informality ensured vulnerability. If success followed her intervention, credit gravitated upward towards sovereign decision. If failure emerged, responsibility descended toward her proximity. Desire itself became a political instrument. Affection within royal chambers could shape diplomatic emphasis. Emotional trust might open channels unavailable through ceremony. Yet this intimacy was framed as indulgence rather than governance. Framing mattered. By labeling female influence as temptation, the system preserved masculine authority. Desire could be acknowledged, but it could not be granted institutional dignity. The mistress thus embodied contradiction. She was necessary, yet unrecognized. Effective, yet unofficial. Visible, yet unprotected. Gender intensified this contradiction. Male courtiers maneuvered openly for office and reward. Their ambition appeared expected. Female ambition, even when subtle, appeared suspect. Suspicion reinforced the imbalance. When a woman benefited from proximity to power, observers questioned her intent. When a man benefited from proximity, observers praised his skill. The difference reflected expectation rather than evidence. Expectation sustained male dominance. By interpreting female influence as a deviation from the norm, the court reaffirmed masculine centrality. Women became conduits rather than principals. Conduits are replaceable. Once strategic utility diminished, the conduit could be removed without destabilizing the broader system. Her removal restored visible conformity. Conformity reassured observers. The imbalance did not arise accidentally. It functioned as a mechanism maintaining continuity. Concentrating authority in male offices simplified succession and accountability. Yet simplicity obscured complexity. Women participated in shaping decisions more frequently than records acknowledged. Their voices filtered through private conversation and informal counsel. The system depended upon such participation, even as it denied it. Denial protected narrative. A monarchy projecting strength required clarity in hierarchy. Admitting shared authorship of policy with unofficial figures complicated that clarity. Thus, political use of women coexisted with a moral critique of them. They were utilized to cement alliances, soften opposition, and distribute favor. At the same time, they were warned against overstepping invisible boundaries. Boundaries remained elastic. They shifted according to circumstance, rarely announced openly. A gesture tolerated during prosperity might provoke outrage during a crisis. The crisis revealed asymmetry. When stability wavered, male authority was defended. Female proximity became suspect. Removal of the woman reaffirmed dominance without questioning the underlying structure. This pattern extended beyond individual cases. It revealed structural lessons about power and gender. Authority was not only about who held office, but about who could be sacrificed to preserve it. Sacrifice fell predictably. The mistress's vulnerability reflected a broader imbalance. Women's contributions operated within a narrow channel defined by male consent. That consent could be withdrawn at any moment. Withdrawal exposed dependency. Dependency reinforced hierarchy. Hierarchy maintained order. The lesson embedded within these patterns was neither subtle nor accidental. Women could shape events, but they could not claim authorship. Their influence remained conditional upon discretion and favor. Favor fluctuated. Institution endured. In Tudor England, power required visible masculinity to legitimize itself. Female influence, therefore, remained shadowed. It functioned beneath the surface. Essential, yet unacknowledged. The imbalance did not erase women from politics. It ensured they participated without protection. Their proximity enabled advancement for families and factions. Their removal reassured public morality. The cycle sustained masculine authority while extracting female contribution. Contribution, unrecorded, is rarely translated into legacy. Legacy, attached to titles and decrees, not to whispered counsel. Thus, the political function of the mistress revealed a broader truth. Gender shaped not only opportunity, but vulnerability. Desire is intertwined with governance. Yet only one side retained institutional shelter. The system endured through asymmetry. Men governed visibly. Women are influenced conditionally. Responsibility followed power, but blame followed vulnerability. Women were employed as instruments within political strategy, while their intimacy was framed as moral weakness. Desire became a tool of governance, without granting women authority to match their influence. Through this imbalance, the Tudor hierarchy preserved male dominance while relying quietly on female participation, which it refused to legitimize. Her presence at court was never accidental. It aligned with opportunity, with calculation, with the silent recognition that proximity to power could serve a larger design. While she remained useful, protection surrounded her almost invisibly. Doors opened, voices softened. Her position appeared secure. Security, however, was conditional. As long as her intimacy reinforced alliances, eased negotiation, or satisfied personal preference without destabilizing authority, she remained sheltered. Those who once watched her carefully refrained from open hostility. The court tolerated her because she functioned within its needs. Function defined acceptance. The moment her proximity threatened balance rather than strengthening it, calculation shifted. Protection thinned gradually at first. Invitations became selective. Conversations cooled. The warmth that had once sustained her position diminished without declaration. Usefulness determined survival. When she facilitated advancement, she was defended quietly. When controversy attached to her name, distance followed just as quietly. The same court that had once accommodated her influence recalibrated in pursuit of stability. No formal announcement marked this transition. Her function ended before she fully recognized it. The alliances she had helped secure no longer required her mediation. The sovereign's attention was redirected. Rivals gained confidence. Her presence no longer offered an advantage. Advantage replaced affection. Affection rarely outlived political necessity. Those who had benefited from her proximity withdrew with measured discretion. They framed their retreat as prudence rather than abandonment. They preserved their own positions by loosening association. The system did not collapse when she left. It adjusted. That adjustment revealed her role with clarity. She had been conduit, instrument, mediator. She had been useful because she operated in the space between official authority and private influence. Once that space narrowed, her relevance diminished. Silence completed what accusation had not required. No verdict declared her guilty. No council convened to assess her conduct. Yet her absence confirmed the conclusion. The palace resumed its rhythm as though nothing had changed. In that rhythm, her political function dissolved. She was remembered selectively, often through language shaped by those who needed explanation for events larger than her influence. Her contribution to alliance building faded into the background. Her intimacy remained foregrounded. Foregrounding simplified memory. Complexity yielded to clarity. The narrative reduced her life to a symbol, useful once, a problematic later. The full scope of her participation rarely survived. This pattern extended beyond the individual case. It revealed structure within Tudor governance. Women near power were admitted conditionally and dismissed quietly. Their value is measured by immediate utility. Their removal justified by moral vocabulary when convenient. The utility offered temporary shelter. Shelter evaporated quickly. The mistress thus embodied both access and expendability. She stood near authority yet outside its protection. She shaped moments yet did not define outcomes permanently. Her ending rarely produced spectacle. It produced quiet. In that quiet lay the true conclusion of her political role. The alliances she once influenced persisted or dissolved according to broader forces. The court endured. The sovereign's authority remained visible. She stepped outside the frame. Her story, however, illuminates the mechanisms beneath ceremony. It reveals how power can rely on individuals. It refuses to recognize formally. It reveals how gender shapes both opportunity and vulnerability. Above all, it demonstrates that usefulness within the hierarchy does not guarantee security. The Tudor court prized stability. It tolerated deviation only when deviation served the structure. Once service ended, correction followed without drama. The woman who had once been an instrument of alliance became a memory of discretion. Her protection lasted precisely as long as her advantage. And when the advantage expired, so did protection. The political function of the mistress concluded not with confrontation, but with absence. Her influence dissolved into the broader current of governance that continued without her acknowledgement. The court maintained order. The monarch retained authority. Her chapter closed quietly. Her story remains instructive. It invites reflection on the relationship between intimacy and institution, between gender and governance, between recognition and utility. It asks how often history records those who shaped events without a title, and how easily it discards them when narrative requires clarity. Tonight, as you consider these quiet corridors and guarded chambers, remember how easily a life could be elevated by proximity and erased by recalculation. The Tudor court moved with ceremony, yet beneath it lay constant adjustment, constant evaluation of usefulness and risk. Her rise and fall were not anomalies, but expressions of a system that valued alliance over affection and stability over loyalty. Thank you for spending this time reflecting on the fragile balance of power and memory within Tudor England. I hope this journey through shadowed corridors and silent negotiations has offered you a clearer understanding of how influence could shape events without ever being formally acknowledged. May your evening be calm, your thoughts unburdened, and your rest undisturbed. Good night.